Imagine opening your eyes one morning and realizing that every ache in your bones, every labored breath, every moment of confusion and pain isn't random at all. It all traces back to a single horrifying truth, and it's not even your fault. You discover that before you ever took your first breath, before your name was even chosen, decisions were made that sealed your fate forever. Your hands tremble, your thoughts cloud, and you finally understand why. Your life has been built on a secret you were never meant to uncover. Now imagine learning that this secret isn't unique to you, that entire royal bloodlines were born into the same nightmare. Behind the gold crowns and velvet curtains lay a world of twisted family trees, where power mattered more than humanity, and keeping the blood pure came at an unimaginable cost. What if the suffering in your body was not the result of chance, but of centuries of choices made by people who would never live to see you suffer? For centuries, Europe's most powerful families believed their right to rule didn't just come from politics or war, it flowed through their veins. They were convinced their blood was different, touched by divinity, and far too sacred to be diluted with anyone outside their circle. To them, marrying a stranger, even another monarch, felt like gambling with destiny. So instead they turned inward. Cousins married cousins, uncles took their nieces as wives, and generation after generation, the family trees of Europe's ruling houses stopped branching and began folding in on themselves like a snake devouring its own tail. The logic behind it was as cold as it was calculated. By keeping the bloodline pure, they believed they were protecting their power, their wealth, and even their souls. But what they didn't realize was that with every union between close relatives, they weren't just preserving their legacy, they were plotting, anting the seeds of their own destruction. By the 16th century, Europe's royal families had become one massive tangled web of interconnections. It didn't matter if you looked to Spain, Austria, or France. Underneath the gilded crowns and velvet robes, the same blood ran through them all. This wasn't love. It wasn't even marriage in the traditional sense. It was a breeding program, one that treated human beings as vessels for dynastic survival. And while it created empires that spanned continents, it also created something else, a genetic time bomb that would eventually detonate in the lives of their children. But the most chilling part, the royals didn't see the danger coming. They thought they were strengthening their legacy. In reality, they were cursing their descendants to carry the weight of their choices in their faces, their bodies, and their bones. At first, the price of keeping bloodlines pure didn't show itself in battlefields or royal courts. It showed up in mirrors. One by one, portraits of Europe's most powerful families began to reveal a haunting pattern. Heavy lower lips, jutting jaws, faces that seemed stretched and distorted in a way that no artist could disguise. Historians would later give it a name, the Habsburg jaw. But to the people living with it, it was more than a strange facial feature. It was a warning carved into bone, a physical sign that the bloodlines of kings and queens were quietly breaking down from within. This wasn't just cosmetic. The jaw deformity made chewing painful, sometimes nearly impossible. Some royal children had to eat food cut into tiny pieces or reduced to mush because they couldn't close their mouths properly. Others struggled to speak clearly, their words trapped behind bone that had grown in all the wrong ways. And the portraits don't lie. From Spain to Austria, the same features repeat over and over, each generation amplifying the last. Scientists today have studied their skulls and traced the deformities to the same cause. Generations of marrying within the family had stacked harmful genes on top of each other until they couldn't be hidden anymore. But the jaw was only the beginning. Behind the walls of palaces, the damage ran deeper than bone. Breathing problems, curved spines, infertility, and mental breakdowns were all waiting in the blood. And the first person to truly live and die with the full weight of this genetic curse would be a young girl born in Vienna in 1634. In 1634, deep inside the shadowed corridors of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, a baby girl took her first breath. Her name was Maria Anna of Austria. What no one would say out loud, but everyone feared, was that her life had already been written in her blood. She was the child of generations of cousins marrying cousins, the latest link in a chain that was starting to strangle itself. From the moment she could stand, Maria Anna knew she was different. Her spine bent unnaturally, forcing her into a painful hunch that made every breath a labor. Her jaw jutted so far forward that eating solid food became an exhausting ritual of careful chewing and cautious swallowing. Servants had to cut her meals into tiny pieces, and even then, every bite felt like a battle. But the physical pain was only half her burden. As she grew, she began to notice the portraits that lined the palace walls, faces of kings, queens, uncles, aunts, and in every one of those painted eyes, she saw herself. The same protruding jaw, the same sloping shoulders, the same twisted spine. It was like staring into a mirror that stretched back for generations, and that was the moment she understood. Her suffering wasn't random. It was inherited. Behind closed doors, the palace physicians whispered about the Habsburg curse, but never to her face. To Maria Anna, they spoke of mysterious ailments and God's will, never daring to admit the truth that her body was breaking because of the choices her family had made long before she was born. Her world became smaller with every year. Curtains stayed drawn to shield her from the curious eyes of the court. Suitors, most of them her cousins, lost interest the moment they saw her frail frame. In a family where marrying your relatives was normal, Maria Anna's condition was too severe to overlook. She became a ghost in her own palace, a living reminder of what happens when power matters more than humanity. By 32, her body finally gave out under the weight of her own genes. The official cause of death listed a handful of vague ailments, but the truth was never written down. Maria Anna of Austria died not from sickness, but from centuries of ambition woven into her DNA. And her story was only the beginning. Across the continent, another royal woman would carry a different piece of the same curse, one that would earn her a name whispered in both fear and pity, Joanna the Mad. In 1479, a princess was born into the powerful Spanish court, destined to be more than just a daughter of kings. Her name was Joanna of Castile, and history would remember her not as a queen or a mother, but as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly insane, or just another victim of a bloodline cursed by its own ambition? Joanna's childhood gave no hint of tragedy. She was brilliant, educated in philosophy, languages, and politics, rare for a woman of her time. But her mind, as sharp as it was, carried a silent inheritance. Like so many European royals, her parents were cousins. The same blood that gave her a crown also carried the genetic seeds of fragility. At 16, Joanna was married off to Philip of Burgundy, a man whose beauty earned him the name Philip the Handsome. But behind the charm was cold calculation. The union wasn't about love, it was politics in silk and gold. Philip was unfaithful, distant, and manipulative, and Joanna, she responded with something that would later define her legacy, an all-consuming, obsessive love. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief shattered into something darker. She refused to bury him. For months, she travelled across Spain with his coffin, opening it again and again to kiss the decaying face inside. Courtiers whispered of madness. But was it truly insanity, or the breaking of a woman raised to believe that her entire worth lay in her marriage, only to have it ripped away? Her father, Ferdinand, saw opportunity in her sorrow. Labelling her mad gave him the excuse to seize her throne. Later, her son Charles would do the same. Joanna spent the next 46 years locked away in cold, dark convent rooms, denied sunlight, companionship, and even basic hygiene. By the time she died in 1555, the world had long forgotten the vibrant, intelligent young woman she once was. Modern historians have begun to piece together the truth. Joanna's so-called madness may not have been madness at all, but a combination of crushing grief, political betrayal, and a genetic vulnerability to depression and anxiety, a vulnerability bred into her by generations of royal inbreeding. Her story is more than a tragic footnote. It's a reminder of how power can twist not only politics but lives. And as Joanna's life ended in confinement, another Habsburg daughter was being prepared to carry the curse into the next generation, a child who would be married to her own uncle before she was old enough to understand what marriage even meant. In 1651, the Spanish court celebrated the birth of a little girl who carried the weight of an empire in her tiny hands. Her name was Margaret Teresa of Spain, and from the moment she opened her eyes, her future had already been decided. She wasn't born to live her own life, she was born to secure a dynasty. Margaret's childhood is immortalized in the paintings of Diego Velázquez. In his portraits you can see her as a small child wrapped in elaborate gowns far too heavy for her frail body. Look closer and the brushstrokes reveal what the court dared not speak aloud. The subtle protrusion of her jaw, the stiffness of her posture, the hints of genetic damage etched into her young frame. By the time she was a toddler, her fate was sealed. She was promised in marriage to her own uncle, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. To the outside world it was a brilliant political move, an alliance to strengthen two powerful thrones. To Margaret, it was a sentence written before she could even speak. At just 15 she became a bride. Leopold was 26, old enough to be her father, and in blood he was closer than that. The wedding was a grand spectacle of gold and ceremony, but behind the glitter a child was being handed over to a man who was both her husband and her uncle. From the moment the vows were spoken, her body was no longer her own. The future of the Habsburg dynasty depended on her ability to produce heirs. Margaret Teresa endured pregnancy after pregnancy despite her frail health. Each one left her weaker, and each one carried the same unspoken fear. Would the child survive, or would the curse of their bloodline claim another life? The results were heartbreaking. A daughter who lived only a few months, a miscarriage, a son born alive but carrying the same genetic deformities that had haunted their family for generations. The court celebrated his birth anyway, not because he was healthy, but because he existed. By 21, Margaret's body was broken. Years of inbreeding had left her genetically fragile, and the strain of childbearing had consumed what little strength she had left. The official cause of death was fever, but the truth was simpler and far more brutal. The dynasty had used her up. Her death was mourned across Europe, but not for the right reasons. To the courtiers and kings, Margaret Teresa was a lost opportunity, a failed vessel in the great experiment of royal blood. To history, she stands as one of the most haunting examples of what happens when human lives are treated as tools to preserve power. And yet the Habsburgs were not finished. Even as Margaret's body was laid to rest, another generation of royal daughters was being prepared for the same fate. One of them would be born into a palace of gold but carry with her the same curse, a Spanish princess who would be sent to the glittering court of Versailles. Anna of Austria entered the world in 1601 as both a blessing and a bargaining chip. The daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, her life was never her own. From childhood she carried the same Habsburg bloodline, already showing signs of strain, slow development, a protruding jaw that made speech and eating painful, and a nervous disposition that we would now recognize as severe anxiety. But none of that mattered. At 14, she was sent away to marry Louis XIII of France in a political union designed to cement peace between two great powers. The French court greeted her with pageantry, but behind the golden halls of Versailles, Anna's reality was isolation and fear. She spoke little French, was torn from everything familiar, and her new husband was a cold, distant man wrestling with his own demons. Years of miscarriages and infant deaths followed, each one weighing heavier than the last. The blame always fell on Anna. Physicians subjected her to brutal treatments, bloodletting, purges, invasive examinations, all without ever suspecting the real cause, a body weakened by generations of inbreeding. The pressure to produce an heir turned the crown into a cage. Gossip spread through the court like fire, whispering that God had cursed her, that France needed a new queen. Anna withdrew into herself, developing a paralyzing fear of public appearances and clinging desperately to religion. After 23 years of marriage, her miracle came, the birth of a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. To the world it was proof of divine favor. To Anna it was survival, but the damage was already done. Years of emotional and physical torment left scars she would carry to her death. A century later, another Habsburg daughter would walk the same path of velvet and suffering. Marie Antoinette, born in 1755 to Empress Maria Theresa and Francis I, carried the same bloodline, the same subtle signs of the genetic curse etched into her delicate jawline. At just 14, she was sent to France to marry the future Louis XVI, a union meant to secure political alliances. But behind the fairy tale image of Versailles lay the same nightmare, a young girl whose body and mind were shackled to the weight of a dynasty. For 7 years, her marriage went unconsummated, fueling vicious rumors while physicians scrutinized her as if she were a defective vessel. When she finally conceived, her pregnancies were fraught with complications, severe miscarriages, hormonal imbalances, and crushing anxiety. The same genetic weaknesses that had haunted Anna of Austria now echoed in Marie's body and mind. As France spiraled toward revolution, the weight of those inherited vulnerabilities became impossible to hide. Her mood swings, her emotional decisions, her moments of confusion under pressure, all were magnified by the world's scrutiny and turned into weapons against her. When the guillotine claimed her in 1793, the blade didn't just end a queen's life. It closed another chapter in the long, tragic story of the Habsburg curse, a story written not in crowns and titles, but in bone, blood, and broken lives. By the late 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty had pushed its obsession with bloodline purity to the breaking point. In Spain, the consequences were no longer subtle. They were catastrophic. The royal nursery looked less like the cradle of an empire and more like a living experiment in genetic collapse. At the center of it all was Charles II of Spain, a king so physically and mentally fragile that history would later call him the Bewitched. His face bore the full weight of the Habsburg jaw, his tongue so large and mouth so misaligned that speaking clearly was a struggle. He suffered seizures, chronic illness, and was likely infertile. Modern genetic analysis suggests his inbreeding coefficient, the measure of how closely related his parents were, was higher than that of a child born to siblings. 16 generations of cousin marriages had converged into one body, and that body was failing. But the tragedy didn't end with Charles. His sisters and cousins, the Spanish infantas, carried their own versions of the curse. Maria Margarita showed severe developmental delays. She couldn't speak clearly until the age of 7 and needed assistance to walk. Her sister, Maria Theresa, suffered from epilepsy so violent it left her unable to stand during attacks, and her spine was so curved she needed supports to sit upright. Others battled respiratory issues, immune deficiencies, and deformities so severe that they were essentially prisoners in their own bodies. Inside the Alcazar of Madrid, the palace had become more hospital than royal residence. Teams of physicians and priests shuffled through dim corridors, documenting symptoms with cold precision. Their reports read like a grim medical manual. Twisted spines, malformed jaws, falling sickness, infants born too frail to survive more than days. Yet even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the marriages continued. These women ain't daughters or sisters in the eyes of the court. They were vessels, their value measured in the children they might produce, no matter the cost. When Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him. The crown passed into foreign hands, and with it came the end of one of history's most extreme genetic experiments. But the human cost could never be undone. The Infanta's broken bodies and short lives were the price of a dynasty that chose power over nature, and in the end, even power couldn't save them. The Habsburg curse wasn't a myth or superstition. It was science unfolding in real time, centuries before anyone understood the word genetics. When closely related people have children, the pool of available genes shrinks. Harmful recessive traits that might have stayed hidden in a diverse population suddenly rise to the surface. And in the royal courts of Europe, where cousins married cousins for generations, those traits didn't just rise, they compounded. Inbreeding depression, as scientists now call it, doesn't affect just one part of the body. It weakens everything. The bones, the immune system, the mind. It explains why so many Habsburg descendants were born with severe jaw deformities, curved spines, and chronic respiratory problems. It explains the high rates of infertility, miscarriages, and infant deaths that haunted their palaces. It even helps illuminate the mental illnesses that plagued women like Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette, genetic vulnerabilities to anxiety and depression amplified by crushing political and personal pressure. Modern research has gone a step further. By analyzing portraits and historical records, scientists have found a direct statistical link between the severity of the Habsburg jaw and the degree of inbreeding in the family tree. Charles II's infamous deformities weren't a coincidence. They were the inevitable endpoint of a bloodline folding in on itself for 16 generations. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the royals knew something was wrong. Court physicians recorded the patterns in painstaking detail: children born weak, illnesses repeating generation after generation, strange deformities appearing more often with each marriage. Yet politics always won over biology. Power was worth more than health. Legacy was worth more than life. Today, the Habsburg tragedy serves as a warning etched in both history and DNA. It reminds us why genetic diversity isn't just important, it's essential to survival. These kings and queens believed they were preserving something sacred in their blood. What they were really preserving were the keys to their own undoing, passing them down with every birth until an empire collapsed under the weight of its own genes. Centuries of power, wealth, and ambition, all built on bloodlines that were quietly destroying themselves from within. The Habsburg dynasty wasn't just a story of kings and queens, it was a story of human beings trapped in a genetic experiment they never chose. Behind the crowns and palaces were women and children born into bodies already carrying the weight of decisions made long before they existed. Maria Anna, Joanna the Mad, Margaret Theresa, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, the Spanish Infantas, and Charles II, each of their lives told a piece of the same story. They weren't cursed by fate or punished by God. They were victims of a system that put power above humanity, tradition above compassion. Their suffering became a legacy written not in gold or glory, but in twisted spines, protruding jaws, and broken minds. And yet in their tragedy there's a strange kind of redemption. Their pain gave birth to understanding. The medical records, portraits, and histories they left behind became the foundation for modern genetics. Their lives taught the world a truth their ancestors refused to see: that strength comes not from purity but from diversity. As we look back at their stories, it's easy to feel the weight of sorrow, but there's also a responsibility hidden in their legacy to never again let ideology or tradition demand the destruction of human lives. Their voices may have been silenced centuries ago, but their message still echoes through time. Remember us, not as royals, not as symbols, but as human beings who deserved better. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is the one their stories leave behind. How many of our lives today are still shaped by choices made long before we were born?